Nick, my man, how you doing? You look good.
Record, my brother. You look good. Your hair keeps growing.
Stop mentioning my hair. I'm getting very
It's
self-conscious,
it's
even
looking
more
very
so than
beautiful.
usual.
You're like a model. Yeah.
Yeah, right. A model academic, maybe. So, folks, we usually don't mention this, but today it's the 15th of October, and I mention this for two reasons. Number one, this is just after the last podcast came out, which by the time you listen to it won't be the last podcast, but we published the how to
I don't
write,
even
or
know
you
what you're
should
talking about.
shut
What
up.
did you
We
say?
we we published a podcast called "You Should Never Write a Conceptual Paper," and for
Yeah.
some reason that one went crazy on the internet, on social media. I don't know why, but we've got 10 times more comments and 1,000 times more impressions and clicks on that one than we ever
Hmm.
had before. This is that one went viral, so to speak. And that connects to the topic we have today. The other reason why I mentioned the date is that this is now 2 weeks after a very interesting special issue deadline has passed. On 1st October, AMR had its deadline for AI in management. And remember that I said I want to see more papers that theorize AI. Well, AMR hopefully has an whole issue dedicated to this. And we have one of the editors of that special issue on today. We have Robert Gregory here. Robert, how you doing?
Hi, I'm doing fine, thank you.
So, Robert, I think that whole big setup that Record just did was right. We talked about conceptual papers,
Yeah.
and you are like the dude who figured out how to publish conceptual papers, right?
Absolutely. You're the theory kind of guy, the conceptual guy in our field. That doesn't give you justice to do lots of things, but you have what, like three AMR papers already? You're now an editor on that special issue, and you've written about theorizing and writing conceptual papers. So you fit perfectly to apparently a topic that gets everyone in rage.
Yeah, it's funny how I got to that. I don't know, shall I tell the story how I got to it,
Yeah.
Yes,
perhaps?
absolutely. Yeah.
So it was in Spain when I was still working at IESE Business School in Barcelona, and I was teaching with the case method. And you know that that's a participant-centered, discussion-based learning approach from Harvard, and we use that at ES in Barcelona. And so, and there was this expectation that you should also write your own teaching cases so that you can manage the debate and the discussion with students in a more authentic way, and you're really an expert on the case, right? So I wrote this case about Facebook, and I was pretty excited about it back in the days. It was the data debacle in 2018, how to move on at Facebook, right?
Ah.
And I started to teach that Facebook case in the classroom, and I used the network effect, lens in order to, discuss with my students platform dynamics and platform growth and how platform businesses are different from pipeline businesses and so on and so forth, right? And students gave me that feedback. Well, why are we not talking more about data and AI? Because that's so obvious that it's so important in this case of Facebook, right? And I was struggling to weave that into my discussion, offer a good framework for how to organize the discussion. The discussion you can imagine with 70 MBA students was going in all kinds of different directions. And I was struggling to put some structure around that discussion. And that was like 2018, and there was not much, frameworks about how to think about data AI on platforms. And so I went out and I started to write a conceptual paper, right? And
Mhm.
in platform scholarship, either you're an excellent case study researcher like Ola, and you write one platform paper after the other, or you're like a quant guy.
Yeah,
Uh,
you're an econometric guy, right?
yeah, econometric guy, and so for me it was like, okay, let's play this conceptual card, and it worked pretty well. Yeah, so that's the short story. Yeah.
That's the short story. So I'm interested, like you're talking about your famous data network effect paper, right? Which created a bit of a stir because I know after the paper got published, there's even I don't know what they call it, a dialogue section, right? Where people respond in writing to your article and then you respond to the responses. Is that correct?
Yeah, so it's a very interesting concept. And by the way, so this data network effect article was a pretty collaborative effort. I need to acknowledge here also Harris Kyriakou and Evgeny Kaganer and Ola Henfridsson, who are very valued co-authors on this paper. I don't think I would have been able to write this alone. But yes, I did lead the effort, and it is very interesting with AMR that they have this debate article section, right? And so the idea is that a theory paper should be the basis for like 1,000 future empirical papers. That's the vision that the former editor-in-chief Jay Barney, well, former editor-in-chief, when I was writing my first AMR, he was still editor-in-chief, and he was presenting that vision in the AMR hackathon. And he was giving this speech about, you need to think about a conceptual paper as the basis for 1,000 future empirical papers. So it has to be very future oriented in a way, right? It has to have pre-science character.
Wait, you went to a hackathon with this paper?
Yes, I went to a hackathon with this paper. Yeah.
What was it?
That was an AMR hackathon, and it was a 2-day event. And we got lucky. It was in Barcelona, so I didn't have to travel for it, right?
Yeah, you took the bus.
I just took the bus.
So you had to apply for this, or?
Yeah, I had to apply for this. So I had to write, basically at that time, I don't remember if it was just Harris and me, or if others were also, if we already had our other co-authors on board, but we wrote this draft, and we submitted it to the AMR hackathon. Yeah, I think it was all the four of us already at that point. And before that, we had a conference paper at the Academy of Management annual meeting. Harris presented our paper. We got very positive feedback from an AMR editor who was in the room in our
Oh,
presentation at
cool.
the Academy of Management conference. So the first step was really a conference submission and presenting and then getting feedback from an AMR editor, which was very encouraging. And then the second step was to submit a full draft of a conceptual paper to AMR. And it got selected. So that it was a competitive process, and it got selected. And we got Alan Afua assigned to mentor the paper and workshop the paper. And so it was a 2-day event, and it was kicked off with the editor-in-chief kind of giving the whole vision about it. Actually, it was not just the editor-in-chief. I mean, he came with his entire associate editor team. It was pretty amazing. So you
But
had
all of them?
all of them except maybe two
Wow.
people who
Wow,
couldn't
that is
travel.
cool.
So you have 80% of the whole AMR board sitting there, and you're
Wow.
able to ask them questions, right? And they present to you the vision about, hey, how AMR works and what are the expectations for such a theory paper, right? And so then you start getting to know the expectations, and then you go into this 2-day workshopping mode where you work with your editor. And also
No
another,
way. You
yeah.
worked, so it's like you and Harris sat down with your editor for the paper and you spent 2 days working together?
Yeah, yeah. And at
Are you
that point,
kidding
I
me?
think Evgeny and Ola were already on board. So all the four of us were in the room, and we were working with Elena Fua on this paper, and it was very hands-on in a sense. I mean,
So wait, Robert, is this before you even submitted to AMR? Is this like after a
yes,
first?
that was before. Yeah, that was before.
Wow, what a commitment.
It was a
Did
huge.
they do they do this all the time?
They don't. I think they don't do it in the same format because it is a huge commitment. And nowadays, what they do is they do what they call paper development workshops. So they change the format, and instead of submitting a full-fledged paper that is already submission that is supposed to look like a submission-ready document, right? You can present a more research in progress conceptual paper, and but then the expectation is that you're not going to be sitting there with the editor for 2 days, but only for a few hours. And that's what I actually did in Lisbon. So I traveled for AMR to Lisbon this year in May, and I was one of the mentors. I was invited as one of the, together with all the associate editors, I was an external invited because of the special issue, right?
Yeah.
And so I went through that process as a mentor in May, and I'm going to do it again now in New York in January. So anybody who wants to come to New York and get feedback from me on some, technology related submission to AMR, go ahead and submit your proposal,
Awesome.
right? Yeah.
So let me use this opportunity, like go back to this data network effect paper. So you said 2018. Now I know Harris, I don't know Evgeny, and Ola, of course, is an established figure in the field. In the episode that got so much traction on social media, we basically discussed whether or not young, emergent, pre-tenure academics should write conceptual papers. And Nick is pretty loud in saying no, they shouldn't. But if I think back,
Actually, I'm
you
very
would have
quiet and soft spoken, as I say.
yeah. Yes, but you would have been such a right, like you and Harris, you were on the tenure clock, right? You were assistant professor at the time.
Yes.
As I said, Ola not, and I don't know Evgeny, so you can fill me in, but you kind of did what Nick told us not to do. Is that right?
It's true. I mean, this project, Harris and I kind of started it when I came from my classroom, and I went straight to Harris's office and I said, Harris, we need to talk. And Harris is somebody who knows very much machine learning methods because he uses them in his research
Yeah.
as a method, and he understands, he understood machine learning better earlier than I did, right? And so I was learning a lot from him in terms of the novel technology, and he was learning from me in terms of theorizing, right? Because that's what I brought to the table from with my grounded theory background.
Yeah.
I learned how to develop theories based on data. And so the jump from developing theory based on data to just developing theory based on examples and anecdotal evidence and observations that you make in the real world is that jump is not that big, right? And so Harris and I started this, and so it's true in the sense that here are two junior people, I mean, two assistant professors who were starting a theory paper project, and I mean, honestly, without the great collaboration with Evgeny, Evgeny at that point was an associate professor and Ola was a full professor. So without the great collaboration with those two guys, plus the editor, without the editor support, I don't think we would have made it. So
Yeah.
I do need to be honest here. This was a highly collaborative effort. And if you are a young scholar and you're doing this for the first time without any guidance from a mentor, if you don't go to a paper development workshop, you don't have a good relationship with develop a good mentoring relationship with an editor. If you don't have somebody as a co-author who has done it before, it is very, very hard, I believe.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So Wrecker,
Yeah.
what Robert's telling us is I'm right. You're you're not. Uh, that's what I just heard. Now, even though you're on my side, right, Robert, you and I are on the same team here. Uh, I do have a complaint about your work. Can I
Go
can I
ahead,
share
go
a
ahead.
complaint with you? And can you address it? I love your papers. I think they're great. You have this paper with Ola in JAIS in 2021 where you talk about phenomenon-driven
Yeah. I
theorizing.
wanted to talk about that too. It's
Yeah,
good.
and I have a
Yep.
bone to pick with you on this because someone could just say theorizing,
Mhm.
right? This whole phenomenon driven, so that's my first is what does that add to just saying theorizing? And and then after you explain, so I'm going to let you explain your view on this thing to us and why we need the word phenomenon driven. And then I'm going to let you know the danger that I think you're posing to the field with this
Yeah,
way of
yeah.
thinking.
No, I think this is an excellent question, and I'll answer it in two different ways. I mean, first, I'll defend it, but then also I'll explain why nowadays I think a little bit different about it. So, first of all, to defend it, I think oftentimes when you have conceptual work, you start with existing literature, right? And you start with some theory. And the risk that I see with some of these theory papers is that they are they're rigorously done. I mean, they have a clear logical reasoning and good arguments and logical arguments. And so they're very rigorous in terms of how they weave together different arguments from different papers and theory, but they're not particularly up to date when it comes to what's happening today. What's happening today? What do we observe today in terms of novel phenomena, right? So, and a good example of a phenomenon-based theory development paper that breaks kind of the tradition is the paper by Alan Afua on crowdsourcing, where the first, it was, by the way, it got three different awards. So it's a multiple award-winning paper. And the whole paper starts with crowdsourcing and a definition of crowdsourcing. And it goes very deep into the phenomenon right from the first paragraph onwards. And what I learned from Jay Barney is that that's not how you would typically write an AMR paper. Typically, the first paragraph of an AMR paper is tell us the common ground. What do we know about a certain literature stream? So you always
Yeah.
start on the basis of the literature, right? And so Alan Afua broke with that tradition with his paper. It got multiple awards. And to me, that was an inspiration to think about theory development more, starting with the phenomenon. And also what I just told you earlier about how did my theory paper or our theory paper, how did it come about, right? How did it come about? It started with teaching the Facebook case in the classroom and really understanding deeply this phenomenon of data and AI on platforms such as Facebook, right? And so I believe that if your deep understanding of the phenomenon is the starting point of your theory may be more relevant and maybe more connected to current or future scholarly conversations. So that's kind of my belief. But I'll
So
also
I
tell
buy
you
that.
a caveat.
I
Yeah.
buy it so far. You haven't lost me yet. I think I'm good with what you've said. So
But
go
I
Can I
on.
tell you
can
the
I can I
caveat. Yeah.
jump in? Before you
Mhm.
get to your second part of the answer, just one clarification question. So when I think about your phenomenon-driven theorizing, I always interpret it as you start with a phenomenon and you use this current real phenomenon out there in the world that we have now. You use that to problematize what we know. Kind of like we had a theory of, I don't know, organizational growth. But, look at Snapchat or, whatever, look at OpenAI. That's not what the theory says. It should have happened. Something else happened. So I'm starting with phenomenon to then problematize the literature against current reality. Now, is that what you mean? I don't think
Yeah,
Yes,
it's
because
quite
that's
that
what you
that's
mean.
what, dude, that's what other
yeah.
people are talking about,
I don't
right?
think that a lot of people do that, but this so problematizing assumptions against reality. But that's not quite what you mean, right? Because you're talking about novel cases and novel phenomena or discovering things and not
No,
necessarily
I do
problematizing.
think that these two things are very closely related. What you say, Jan, I think this is a very excellent point. I think actually in the data network effects paper, we did actually problematize the network effects literature, and we did
Yeah.
problematize this assumption that that perceived value for each user is simply a function of the size of the network and the number of users. And we did problematize that, right? And we also laid out an alternative assumption ground. We had four assumptions on the basis of which we developed our theoretical framework. And so we did kind of follow this problematization exercise. I do think that problematization is a key technique in phenomenon-based theory development. Now, I'm using this word phenomenon-based theory development more recently because, funnily, the same time that we published our phenomenon-driven theory development paper, the same time, all of a sudden, this paper comes out in AMR called Phenomenon-Based Theory Development by Fisher et al. And
Yes.
it was a complete coincidence. Like we don't know these people, and we didn't know that they're writing this editorial, but it came out at the same time. So we both had kind of the same idea at the same time. And I do think that it tells us that there is a trend in management that we're looking for. And also the whole special issue on AI is another example of that. We're looking for more papers in management that connect to the current changes that we're seeing because the world is changing in a big way because of technology, right? And so, and because of other things, but the society is changing and technology is driving some of those societal changes, and those are impacting organizations and leading to transformations and changes. And so there is a recognition in the field of management that we need to revisit some of our, some of our basic assumptions, like the behavioral theory of the firm. Is it just, human beings? Is an organization just humans and the relationships between humans? What about the technology in all of this and the AI? And there are so many things that we could talk about here, but it's basically, I think the management field is waking up to this need to revisit some of the old theories. And that's why
Right.
phenomenon-based theory development is a way to go in order to,
Mm.
problematize and then develop new theory.
Yeah, but here's the thing. So, yeah. So if I go to and you guys got right where if you go to Afua and Tucci's paper, I just pulled it up. It's a problem solving paper. It's like we have this theory on problem solving and search, right? Proximal and distal search. That's been around since the 1950s, at least, probably before. You use network theory. When you read your paper, you're not talking about theory. You're talking about how the phenomenon is going to drive all your management thinking. I think what you're saying right here is, hey, we have theories. We need to update them.
Mm.
Good papers in the field of information systems have been doing this for decades, right? So as far as that's concerned, it's information systems theorizing. That's how you do it. As there are new technologies, excuse me, you theorize the new technology. Now, what you're saying is in management, they don't do that necessarily. They kind of think that firms are the same and that people are the same. So they need to think about phenomena, except look at platform stuff that you just talked about, right? That's phenomena that are driving 2 decades of theorizing. So I think even theorizing is theorizing, and sometimes it's informed by, things that are happening in the world. So that's, I guess, my danger. If people embrace this phenomenon-based theorizing, they might think it gives them license to really focus on the phenomenon at the expense of problematizing theory. Uh, And I'm fine with it. I agree with everything you just said. I agree with both your paper and this Afua and Tucci paper. I think they're beautiful papers, but it's because they engage with existing knowledge. And when I read your JAS paper, I felt like the engaging with existing knowledge was very much backgrounded and perhaps not really, you guys didn't focus on that too much, right?
Yeah, that's true. But I need to kind of say something here, Nick. I think it's not just about revisiting and extending or revising previous theories. It's also sometimes, challenging existing theory. And I think what we do in the data network effects paper, we don't just simply extend. I mean, yes, we connect to network effects literature, and we, in a way, extend it. That's true. But we also challenge a key assumption, and I
Mhm.
think that's very important for AMR papers. And I think the other thing that I wanted to say is that there are a lot of management scholars who have already embraced this phenomenon-based theory development approach, and one of them is, for example, Sebastian Reich, who is the
Yeah.
leading our efforts on the special issue. He has published recently also a very interesting paper that is forthcoming on also taking a problem-solving perspective about theorizing about human and machine collaboration. And
Yeah.
so there are more and more people in management who are embracing this approach, right?
Yeah,
So can
good.
I want to get to two things. Like one of them is the AI special issue. We can put that in the back. The other one is a little bit like writing for AMR versus writing for, MI's Quarterly ISR, like these different journals, what you can say there. But before we get there, I'm still with your model of phenomenon-driven theory. I just want to two questions to clarify, because I think when I look at your model, two words stand out for me. One of them is really in the top box, novel yet unexplored phenomenon, and here's the kicker, worth theorizing about. That's a key qualification, right? Not every phenomenon is worth theorizing about. So I wanted to ask you how do we know something is worth theorizing? So that's one. And the other aspect that I know you talk about this in the paper, but maybe you can talk about it on air, is this qualification of theory as future-oriented theory. Now, right, what's a future-oriented theory? So how do we know what phenomena is worth theorizing, and what the hell is a future-oriented theory, uh,
Yeah.
Robert?
No, I think that's very interesting. I mean, I think when you think about how do we attribute worth to something, right? And it depends on what perspective you take. You could look at things from a market perspective. You could look at things from a civic perspective, from a domestic perspective, inspirational perspective. So there are different kind of worlds of worth, or the different kind of views of what is worth. And for example, let's say you have all this platform scholarship, and they look at it. They have at some point in time, they've looked at it mainly from a market perspective, right? Matching supply and demand. And then at some point, people came along and said, wait a minute, we need to look at it from a different perspective. And there's this phenomenon around platforms that they also create social change, and they have an impact on society. And it's not just a marketplace, but there's something more going on here, right? And then so that there's a novel phenomenon worth theorizing, worth looked at from a certain perspective that we haven't taken yet, right? And that would
Well,
come
let me play that back, right? Because I think this is key, because it connects to this danger that this model gives, right? So it kind of gives leeway to people to say, like, here's a new phenomenon. Robert has given me a free ticket to theorize about it and say everything is new and everything is different, right? And I think what he's saying here is, well, you gotta establish the worthiness, and I think the onus here is on the author to make that argument that it's worth theorizing
Yeah, but
about.
you know how
No,
you do that? That's very easy, and Robert already told us that. How do you know something's worth theorizing about? Well, if they question an assumption. If there's an assumption, or you didn't say question, you said
challenge.
challenge an assumption. Same thing, right? So question, challenge, potentially show a boundary condition for the assumption, however you want to go about argue for it. If there's an assumption that's prevalent and a new technology seems to indicate that that assumption doesn't hold, then it's probably worth theorizing about, is what I would argue. Now, again, I worry about phenomenon based, and I worry. So with AB and Michel Avital a couple years ago, we wrote this little commentary in JIT. I was actually arguing with my own advisor, right? Kale and Varun wrote this little thing saying we need novel theories in IS research. And they're probably right. Like you read their article, it's a nice article. But what we said is the problem is not so much what you wrote, it's how people are going to read it. And there are all these people in the field of information systems that are just thrilled with technologies. They're thrilled with AI, whatever, any new technology. And when they read, oh, new theory from Kale and Varun, or when they read from you, phenomenon-based theory, they're like, oh, I'll just say I'm doing that. And I can make up stuff, right?
Hmm.
And they don't realize and that's why we wrote that clickbait, theorizing paper. It's like what you're doing is you're encouraging clickbait. You're encouraging someone who doesn't necessarily want to do their reading. You're giving them cover or maybe misguiding them. And I'm not saying you, I'm saying, if this idea of emphasizing the phenomenon over the existing theory, your people will use that and say, we're doing phenomenon based, and then they'll ignore existing theory, right?
But there's something important that going back to Jan's point about prototyping future-oriented theory, and I think it's not just you cannot just say, look, there's this phenomenon that is novel, and that gives me like a blanket check for this is why I have a solid motivation for developing this theory. I mean, it has to be more than that, as you say, Nick, right? But going back to Jan's point, I think if you have a clear vision in the introduction of your paper for how you think that a new theoretical framework that you are going to propose is going to shape the future scholarly conversation, maybe shift it in a new direction that is needed because of certain developments that are happening in organizations in regards to how people use technology, in regards to how the society is evolving because of technological change, whatever, right? So if you kind of foresee, look, there's something, you can make a very solid argument. We should be paying more attention to this and that, and that's where the future scholarly conversation needs to go. Then you are setting yourself on the path of future-oriented theory in a way. You're trying to influence and shape the future scholarly conversation, not just based on a rigorous literature review, just fit within, the conformity and the kind of the confirmation bias. And, yes, just kind of repeat in other words and synthesize what we already know. No, that's not a future-oriented theory, right?
Okay,
Mhm.
I gotcha. So, and I think this is what I mean when I said my interpretation of your model is that it's not a blanket check because the very, very first box, the first step is this important aspect about it must be worth theorizing. And this is your time. Like you have to give that argument, and I reserve the right to reject that argument. Like if you say it's a paper like, oh, here, I do phenomenon-based theorizing because Grove and Litton said we need more theory. I can say, I'm sorry, that's just not a good argument testifying that whatever you're theorizing about is worth theorizing about. Give me a better argument, right? So it kind of invites even the reader saying like, no, that's not a good rock. Bring me a good rock. I want to have a solid argument. Now, the argument could be, as you said, like, it could be financial, like lots of money is being made or lost or whatever. It could be humanistic, it could be shift in perspective, but only if I connect it to an argument that people buy, right? And if I don't buy
Right.
it, then the blanket check is gone.
Exactly.
Absolutely, absolutely. So, for example, right, you could argue that existing discourse on a topic is incomplete, and you could argue that, why, if we just look at it from this one perspective, we're missing out on an opportunity to explain this and this aspect of the phenomenon that remains unexplained until we also take in this other perspective, right? And that's an example. Or, for example, there's inconsistency, right? You have tons of empirical research, and empirical research is going in divergent, different directions, right? Some empirical studies are saying A, and other empirical studies are saying B. And, yes, we could do like the next 100 empirical studies using the same assumptions and the same theoretical premises and constructs, but will we really shift the needle? Because something is not well understood about this phenomenon that we need to have new theory, right? And
Mm.
so there's all kinds of different ways in which you can motivate an article and then say, why do we need a conceptual paper and why is this phenomenon worth theorizing? But it has to be done rigorously. I fully agree with both of you.
So like I mentioned this earlier, like you've written some theory, like you come from a ground theory background, you've published those in ISR, in MSQ, a few of those, and now you've published a few in AMR. Like, what's the same and what's different? I'm pretty sure that a lot of listeners want to know, like, how is writing for AMR and how is it different from, our journals? What's the
Yeah,
same and what's different? What would you say?
that's a very good question. So the first major difference is I mean, we don't like to look at it that way as IS scholars, but we are more like a specialist discipline, right? And general management is more a generalist discipline, right? I mean, so the first big difference is that an AMR paper has to appeal to a more general audience. You will have readers who are not necessarily information systems teachers and scholars, but who may be marketing or operations or strategy scholars, but who have some affinity towards technology and change,
Yeah.
right? And so you may have those kind of readers, and so you need to appeal to that broader audience, which means
So you
that
need to dumb it down for them.
I wouldn't put it. Let me rephrase. Let me rephrase. You need to generalize more. You need to raise the level of abstraction, which is maybe you could look at it as dumbing it down, but I wouldn't call it like that, right? I would rather say there are different levels of generalization and abstraction, and when you go to AMR, you have to just raise the level of abstraction and try to create a more generalizable framework that applies to more context, right? And so it's just broader. It's just broader. For example, in IS, people will always ask you to zoom in more on the technological artifact and the interactions with the artifact and the usage of the artifact and all these kind of things, right? And so in AMR, you won't get the same kind of scrutiny to go in that level of detail, right? But then they will ask you to elaborate much more in the paper on what is it that we already know and how are you challenging or revisiting or creating an alternative or extending some existing theory. And so you need to be very rigorous in building upon and extending the theory, right? And because the emphasis will be slightly in a different corner, right? And this affects kind of how what kind of a question are you asking? And so I can give you an example if you want. I can give you an example for this.
Yeah, go
Is
for it.
okay? So the Cooperation Among Strangers paper that we wrote, it was a very interesting journey because initially, Roman and I came together and we said, I told Roman, he gave a presentation about blockchain at a seminar in Germany, and I said, I listened to his presentation on blockchain, and I was just about to move to Miami. I knew that Miami is going to be big on crypto and blockchain. I have to get into this research topic, right? So I listened carefully to Roman's presentation. I said, Roman, we have to write an AMR about this. You have some great ideas here. So we started working together. And later we brought on, of course, our other co-authors, Ola and Niam. But, Roman and I basically what we did we started to think about blockchain more from, I wouldn't say information systems perspective, but I would say from a network perspective. We looked at it from networked ways of organizing. So as opposed to hierarchy and market network forms of organization. And we looked at it from that perspective. And, there's this whole literature in IS about inter-organizational information systems, right? So it kind of connected to that stream of research in IS as well. And that was our starting point. Then we went to AMR. Of course, AMR comes back to us and says, you need to broaden this, right? The scope of your theoretical framework needs to be much broader. And one of the reviewers asked the question, how does your theoretical framework relate in general to how you facilitate cooperation among how you facilitate cooperation in general in social and economic exchanges in general, not just networked organizations. And the
Mhm.
feedback of that reviewer made us to rewrite the entire front end of the paper and rethink our framework in terms of this broad challenge and discover this very interesting puzzle in the literature about cooperation among strangers. And then when we found that literature, we said, we have found a home for this paper because that's essentially what blockchain is about. Blockchain
Mhm.
facilitates cooperation among strangers. That's the unique selling point or the uniqueness of the blockchain.
Yeah.
And then we thought, like, okay, with the help of that reviewer, who was obviously a very experienced AMR kind of person, obviously, to ask those kind of smart questions, um, yeah, we were able to write the paper in the
Yeah.
way that it's now published, right?
Yeah. So, and you did say you're moving to Miami. So you're in Miami now, where, I know you have a bunch of cryptocurrencies, and I know you have this Ferrari that you drive around in. And so whenever I see whenever I see Robert, he's always got his shirt unbuttoned about halfway. So he's fully assimilating to Miami. But I have a question for you, Robert. If you're in Miami, why does Wrecker have more of a tan than you do? Why don't you? Do you never leave your office?
Oh, I actually do. I actually do. But I leave my office very early morning. I play tennis in the mornings before the sun rises so that I don't get a sunburn. And getting sunburns in Miami is arguably more unhealthy than getting a sunburn in
Yeah,
Germany because of the intensity of the sun here. So you have to be careful.
yeah,
So
yeah.
I have a follow-up question to this same, what's the same and what's different? Um, I would wager, like you mentioned this reviewer who you said he is obviously an AMR scholar, like very skilled in theorizing, abstraction, etc. Are the people at AMR better at theorizing than IS people are? Because I would say no. On that, I think they're all the same. It happens to be a theory on a journal to a different audience. I get that, but I don't think that it's better or worse in theory development than
Yeah.
anybody else.
No, this is a very excellent question, and this is actually an important question for our field. If we want to think about how do we become better at theorizing, which is something that is close to my heart to try to help people. The way that I edit papers, I try to, take a hands-on approach to editing papers in JS, and I try to help authors to learn the skill and the art and craft and give them feedback beyond just the editor report. In some occasions, I would get on a call with the authors and try to coach them, right? But basically, I think the question is very important, and I wouldn't say that the management scholars who publish in AMR are better theorizers than information systems scholars. That's not the way I think about it. The way I think about it is that they just have better support structures. So
Interesting.
they have. I mean, you think about how long has AMR existed and built up a repertoire and scripts about how to do it, right? And there is like tons of editorials that have been written, right? And it's so many editorials that I based my entire PhD course on Miami based on all these editorials. That's how many editorials have been written over the decades, starting
Yeah.
with the very
Good
good
point.
one from 1989 about organizational theories and the boundaries of theories and and so on and so forth, right? And so
Bacharach's a great book.
Bacharach 1989, right? One of those classics, and so basically there's just a wealth of best practices that have been documented and disseminated, and there's amazing support structure and also the whole culture of AMR, the way that they do all these workshops. I mean, they do like 4 or 5 every year. It's amazing. They take their entire editorial team and travel around the globe and just mentor and mentor and mentor like crazy.
That's
And
wonderful.
so
That
and
is
so I think
wonderful.
those are the kind of support structures that I'm talking about, and we don't have that in IS, right? And
Yeah.
so
Because we're
that's
not big enough or not professional enough or not wealthy enough.
we are professional, but we are maybe not big enough. But also, I think because of what you said in the beginning, the critique about phenomenon, that it's more phenomenon based, and that becomes like a blanket, and to become more descriptive in sense, right? I mean, that is an issue, right? That is an issue that we need to think beyond the phenomenon, and we need to think about our set or body of different theories that we and see how we can systematically develop a culture within the journals among editors also to encourage more submissions and help people to publish these kind of papers that build upon and extend IS theory. And somehow it's about culture, it's about training. It's not, I mean, we are professionals. It's just that uh, are we willing? Do we all think it's important enough? And there have always been a few, people like Dorothy Leitner, people like Susanne Rivard. There are many people that come to mind who have always taken this topic of conceptual papers and theory very seriously in the IS discipline. But
Yeah.
we need to have, of course, enough of those sort of people, a critical mass, and then come together and promote it even more, right? And so that's
Maybe a starting point would be to have a theory conceptual paper development workshop more than the one that comes to mind is the JS one, right? JS has had for a long time had a theory paper development workshop, which is an institution by now. But that's it, right? I mean, that's the only thing. There's a few journals that even accept theories. I tend to say, look, you can submit to MISQ theory and review, but they want a particular type of theory paper. You can submit, I think you can always submit a theoretical paper to JS, right? That's my perception. But if these two fail, you don't have a lot of places to go.
Yeah. Well,
Well,
maybe,
that,
yeah,
that's
yeah.
interesting.
But I don't know. I think so. You have MISQ and ISR. They'll both take theory and conceptual papers. You have JAIS. I think JMIS is and then places like ISJ, JIT. I mean, come on, we have like
Do they
a
take
dozen.
theory only papers though?
Sure, information and organizational take theory only. There's
Okay.
a bunch
All right,
of
fine. All
things
right,
that'll take.
I'll send.
Yeah, I think we do, and I've heard that too. But that's the problem in our field in general is that if you're going after MISQ or ISR with and you don't get those, then now you have a bunch of good journals, but they're not MISQ and ISR. But that goes for conceptual too, I guess. I don't know.
Well, my go-to place for conceptual papers, usually the first choice, except if I think it's really a theory and review, is actually JIS. Not a
Yeah,
second choice, not a third, like literally the first. Because
yeah,
I found, like, just anecdotal, my own experience, I found them to be very receptive in the sense that they don't publish everything, but they receive and they
yeah,
consider all of
yeah.
these
Whereas
papers. And
yeah,
not all of them do it, but some of the other ones you do get, thrown out for lack of fit or whatever.
yeah, MISQ and ISR, you're going to get rejected unless you get really lucky. So
But there's something else that is very interesting as an observation of having done this a couple of years at JS now, is that there is a need to educate reviewers more on how to review
Yeah.
and how to assess theory papers. And
yep,
I think you mentioned that in your last episode as well. I think you talked about that. I think, people expect that there is this empirical test or validation, right? And so sometimes I deal with
yep,
reviewers who are basically rejecting the theory paper just because I don't believe it, I don't see the validation, right? And if I don't see the validation, then how can I believe it? And so this whole idea about a theory paper that it stands on it stands on the power of its logical conceptual arguments. I think Nick, you explained in the last episode a little bit as well. I mean that is hard to do well, but that's the only way that you can convince the reviewers. But reviewers have to also be open-minded about that. That's a possibility that the
yeah,
paper can be well done and can be publishable, even if it doesn't have the empirical validation and test. And that's something that Dorothy and I wrote in our editorial about theory and theorizing. That we expect reviewers to be open-minded about that possibility that there isn't no empirical validation, no empirical test, right? Yeah.
yeah. Well, and editors are weak, right? So editors won't do that. They'll just take whatever reviewers are saying instead of letting the reviewers know that they're.
So, Robert, you're not everyone may know this, but you're basically a senior editor at JS for a couple of years now, with an emphasis, or you're leading the theory section or something, right? So yeah, that
Yeah.
means someone writes a theoretical paper, chances are it ends up with you. Now, do you see trends? Like, do you get a lot of these submissions? Because I wager you don't. How many theory papers do you handle?
Yeah,
Is that a
that's
lot or
true.
not?
I complain that I don't get enough papers on
Yeah,
my desk,
that's what I'm
right?
figuring.
Yeah, and I want to have more work at JS. And so basically, I get maybe one paper a month, and I don't think that's enough. I mean, I think we should be getting at least two or three conceptual papers a month, right? But we don't. And so I think it's a missed opportunity. And maybe it's because of one thing that you just mentioned earlier, because of the perception of JS of not being, it's not UT Dallas, and so it's not like top notch A plus, right? And so okay, so maybe that's part of the reason. And also paired with what we said earlier, that it's very hard to write conceptual papers, and oftentimes it's something that people at a later stage of their career do. But people at the later stage of their career, they're also oftentimes the ones who want to publish mainly in the UT Dallas, right? And so because they have these performance expectations and whatnot. So maybe it's a combination of those factors that we don't get enough submissions. Uh, or maybe it's just a lack of interest because people still believe that, I remember when I was doing my PhD and getting mentorship from senior scholars in the IS field, there was a little bit of this bias, if you really write these write empirical papers, then you really demonstrate that you're a great scholar to get tenure, there's this bias towards that's the real work, and
Yeah.
maybe there is a bias in the field. Maybe there is a
Oh,
bias.
there it is. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, yeah, you're one manifestation of that, Nick.
What?
Hey, well, you kind of say the same thing, right? You're like, do the empirical work, be good at a method,
Hmm.
etc. And then if you have some spare time, if you feel like
It's
you
not
can do
spare
theory,
time.
like,
It's like learn something, right? People are gonna, I don't know.
look, we're moving towards the end here, but I do want to ask. I do want to ask about that AI special issue. Now, I know it's early days. It's 2 weeks past the submission deadline. I just want to ask, like, do you already know how many submissions you got? Like, can you tell us
Yes.
something? Like, did you
Yes.
get a lot or not? Is it exciting? Are you guys, your
It's
editorial team?
it's pretty exciting. We got 114 submissions, which is a record. The only other
Really? That's
Yeah,
cool.
the other highest number before was 88 for any special issue in the past. So
That's cool.
it's really the most popular special issue in the history of AMR. And it's quite amazing the diversity of different topics that people are tackling. I mean, I've only screened 15 of those papers, like Sebastian Reich, who is kind of leading and coordinating us as a group. He assigned 15 papers to each editor for the initial screening. So I've looked closely at 14 or 15 so far. But even just the diversity within that set is just amazing, right? So people are theorizing about the interrelationship between AI and all sorts of different phenomena
Yeah.
related to management, all sorts. I mean, it's going to be a pretty interesting, and I mean, the interesting thing is that the editor-in-chief told us that there is no limit on the number of papers. So
That was
it's
my
not
next
that,
question. Like,
yeah,
do you have a limit or not? You don't have a limit? You could
no,
publish 20 of those?
no. We could publish 20 of those if they're all good quality. It's all about the quality. It's all about whether they convince editors and of
Because
course,
Because I
yeah.
was thinking like 115, that sounds great, and it's great for you and you know the entire point of this special issue. But if I'm an author, by the way, I'm not. I didn't submit anything, but that's daunting, right? Because that's a stiff competition. Because in a specialist, you're kind of competing for space, right?
Well, that's what everybody thinks, but no, actually, the editor-in-chief, she's very supportive of this special issue, and she says that there's no limit, and that means that it's really just about the quality, and then we'll see how many go through the review process in a positive way that they can be published, right? But I expect it will be quite a few papers. It won't just be a small special issue with like 3 or 4 papers. That's
No,
not.
it doesn't sound like it. Not from 115 papers.
No,
Well, that's
no.
wonderful. Hmm.
Well, are you going to force everybody to conceptualize AI properly, or are you going to let them get away with pretending AI is a thing?
Well, it's interesting, right? Because the way that this will be organized is that papers are going to be assigned to specific AEs, and you know that there's also quite a diversity of AEs on the board on the special issue, right? And so I guess that each editor will handle that slightly differently. Although we do have some alignment within the team that we want to. So basically, the general thing is this: we want to find the right balance between yes, taking the phenomenon, taking the AI seriously, so that you're being accurate. You're being accurate about what you say about AI. So a paper that just uses AI as like a buzzword and a label, and underneath the hood, when you look at the actual writing, there is actually no evidence for that authors are thinking of AI. So you know that's not what we want, right? On the other hand, if a paper goes too much onto the technical side of things and goes too deep into AI from a technical perspective, maybe there's not enough space in the paper to actually connect to an extent management theory, and then there is a risk that the paper would not convince in terms of the management theory contribution. And so those papers we also don't want, right? So it has to be at the sweet spot. Every paper needs to be at the sweet spot between those two extremes. And so that's the shared understanding within the editor team. But then, of course, there are nuances, of course, that I guess will will play out according to which editor handles the paper. And we have people who are like more macro, more micro. And of course, the way that you look at AI in a macro paper is going to be very different than
Yeah.
it all depends also on the type of paper, what level and what theory that you relate to, and so on.
Well, Robert, I mean, I gotta say, like, I've been looking forward to this, and I can't wait to see these articles, in print whenever, like, maybe in a year or two or something, right? So we'll have to get you back on just to talk about the AI special issue in AMR. I really think that's a big deal.
Yeah.
So, but now I think we got to stop here, right? Nick has to take a shower.
Hey, I have to shower and then I have to get going to this. There's a
So,
presentation. Yeah.
yeah. Okay. Well, Robert, it was fantastic talking with you, right? We'll pick your brain another time about that special issue once you've made a little bit more progress with that. Thanks for everything that you do, especially
Yeah,
with pushing theory. I like it. I know that Nick doesn't, but
you're awesome.
I'm a
No,
fan
I
of it.
think Robert's awesome. I just try to create some controversy in this podcast, right? And
All
no
right.
one wants everyone to just always like each other and get along. We have to create controversy here, Wrecker.
I love your
Okay.
questions, and you're doing a great job with the podcast. Thank you so much for the invitation.
All right. See ya. Thanks.
See ya,
Take care.
guys.